Spices like cumin, nutmeg, black pepper, and so many others have impacted the world in huge ways. Trade, war, economies have all been built on or fought over them. And yet I don't see spices represented too often in fiction. Aside from the obvious, of course.
Spice.
But the spice melange is used more like a drug than an actual spice. Yeah, it's consumed, but around the galaxy, that's mostly for navigators to facilitate space travel. Apparently, it tastes like cinnamon.
Spice.
So, how are spices important to human history, and how can we use that to inform our stories? To discuss the importance of spices, we should first talk about why spice is part of our diet in the first place. After all, everything in nature has a role to play. Probably. I'm a writer, not a biologist. Plants have evolved all kinds of defenses to avoid being eaten. Thorns, odors, poisons, and so on. That's where we get our spices from. Dill's bitterness is a poison. The capsaicin in hot peppers is a chemical irritant. Saffron is toxic. Yet, humans have grown to ignore or enjoy eating them. Well, not perfectly. Too much saffron at once can actually kill you.
Spice.
But why did we start eating dangerous plants? Ironically, it was important to our survival. In a study by Jennifer Billing and Paul W. Sherman, they tested 30 spices and found that every single one demonstrated some amount of protection against bacteria. So, if you couldn't freeze your food, lathering it in spice helped it stay fresh longer. Turns out that's pretty important around the equator, which is unsurprisingly where most spices come from. And besides all that, spices are delicious. The majority of spices come from regions with a lot of biodiversity, so we're generally looking at warmer climates. Oregano comes from Greece, garlic is from Central Asia, cinnamon from India, and ginger from Southeast Asia. Over in the Americas, we get allspice, cayenne pepper, and cocoa. Finally, in Maluku, previously named the Spice Islands, they produced nutmeg and cloves. So what if you didn't live in one of these regions? Well, trade and conquest. Well, mostly conquest with a little trade sprinkled in.
Spice.
There's evidence of trade as far back as 4,000 years ago, when cinnamon first showed up in the Middle East from India. Of course, savvy traders of the time knew to keep their sources a secret, and told fantastical stories about where their spices came from to lead their buyers astray. Why does all this matter to us, though? We're writers, not historians. Well, maybe that's not quite true. Brian McClellan's Powder Mage novels are inspired by the Napoleonic era, and Wakanda is based on several African cultures. We can see this especially in their architecture and clothing. History is a massive source of inspiration for writers, and always has been. So, let's imagine a story about a spice trader from the Middle Ages, selling to people who have no other access to their goods, traveling by land from a country far away. Imagine the adventures that person might have. Perhaps they discover a new spice, or uncover a magical gateway while traveling to restock. Or maybe the spice itself is a key to some kind of sorcery. When looking at human history, eventually you get to colonialism, which was heavily driven by the spice trade. I know this is a tough subject, but we can learn a lot from it about the lengths people will go through and have gone through just to get access to something they want, especially if it's spice. When Christopher Columbus began crossing the Atlantic Ocean in 1492, he was looking for another route to China, India, and the Spice Islands. His goal was basically to get filthy rich off silk and spices. Of course, what he discovered was the Bahamas Archipelago, Hispaniola, and parts of South America. Stubborn bastard insisted they were the East Indies the whole time. Nutmeg was especially important to the Europeans. Rumor had it that the spice would ward off plague, plus it was pretty fashionable. It, along with cloves, were so popular they started a conflict in Europe. Around 1512, the Portuguese established several bases on the Maluku Islands and formed a monopoly on nutmeg. That lasted for about 70 years, inciting a bidding war back in Europe. And finally, let's not forget about how the English gained control of a tiny island called Rouen in 1616. Rouen was the only nutmeg-producing location the Dutch didn't control at this point, so naturally they did the only logical thing and went to war for it. In retaliation, the English seized a colony the Dutch controlled across the Atlantic called New Amsterdam. In the end, the empires traded colonies. The Dutch got Rouen and solidified their monopoly, while the English got New Amsterdam. They renamed it New York. All of this to say, spice is important. It's powerful, and according to human history, it's worth killing for. Not only can it cause war, the regions ravaged by this type of colonialist extraction feel long-term effects. I mean, just look at the infrastructure built during this time in the countries affected by the colonists. You'll see railroads and paths cut straight to a port, built to extract resources, not facilitate any meaningful travel. Not to mention all the cultural erasure and genocide. So even if you're not writing about an ongoing spice trade, it would have an incredible impact on your world's history. When you're thinking about that next project or you're seeking a way to expand your world building, consider what sort of spices are around, which are worth going to blows over. Maybe instead of a global domination style bad guy, we could have an antagonist start a conflict over something based on economics and trade. After all, what's the point of controlling everything if you aren't living in luxury, eating well? I can't be the only one who thinks it would be neat to see dragons fighting over cinnamon. And of course, when describing the food within a culture, consider adding a mention of their favorite flavors. Include goods they get locally as well as ones they would trade for. After all, a big drive of the spice trade was simply because people wanted their food to taste better. There's a lot of history around humanity's relationship with spices. A lot of it not so great, but all of which we can use to feed our world building and inspire unique stories. Thanks for watching.
Spice.